My stepfather smiled into the microphone at my mother's funeral reception and announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that she had died broke, and that everything she ever promised me was just the sad fantasy of a woman who never understood money. Then he turned to me, raised his champagne flute, and said, to Eleanor, who always meant well. The room laughed. Politely. The way people laugh when they don't know what else to do. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just looked at the small bronze key my mother had pressed into my palm 2 hours before she died, when it was just the two of us and the sound of the monitors. And I thought she knew this moment was coming. Before I tell you what that key unlocked, and how I used it to dismantle a man who had spent 15 years building his kingdom on my mother's name, drop your answer in the comments first. What is the most publicly humiliating thing someone in your family has ever done to you? I read every single one. My name is Serena Voss. I'm 31 years old. I'm a forensic accountant, which means I spend my professional life finding the money people swear doesn't exist. The irony is not lost on me. My mother, Diane, married Douglas Voss when I was 9 years old. Before that, it was just the two of us in a 2-bedroom apartment in Providence, Rhode Island, eating cereal for dinner twice a week, reading library books because we couldn't afford cable. I didn't know we were poor. I thought we were cozy. Douglas arrived with a silver watch and a Category 5 confidence that I mistook, at 9 years old, for competence. He wore linen shirts. He talked about liquidity and leverage at the dinner table. He called my mother Diane darling in a voice that made it sound like a polite insult. Within 2 years of the marriage, she quit her teaching job because Douglas said it was embarrassing for his wife to take a bus to work. Within 4 years, everything she owned, her savings, her small inheritance from her own mother, the deed to the Providence apartment, had been folded into something Douglas called the Whitmore Family Fund, which was named after his mother. Not mine. She wasn't a wife. She was a deposit. I watched it happen. I was a child. And then I was a teenager. And then I was an adult, watching from a careful distance. And I could never prove what I suspected, that my mother had been quietly, systematically drained. She got sick when I was 28. Ovarian cancer, stage 3. Diagnosed on a Tuesday in November. I drove from Boston to their house in Greenwich every weekend for 14 months. Douglas was often traveling. Business, he said. I made her soup. I refilled her prescriptions. I slept on the floor beside her bed during the bad weeks, because the sound of another person breathing helped her sleep. 2 hours before she died, when the medication had stripped everything down to the bone, she reached into the drawer of her bedside table, pulled out a small bronze key on a plain ring, and pressed it into my hand. Safety deposit box, she whispered. Citizens Bank. Box 114. The account is in your name. Has been for 10 years. Douglas doesn't know it exists. She closed her eyes. He's going to tell you there's nothing, she said. Don't believe him. I waited 3 weeks before going to the bank. I waited because Douglas watched me during those 3 weeks with the careful patience of a man who believed he had already won. He was warm at the funeral. Gracious. He cried beautifully, the kind of crying that looks like grief but functions as performance. He called me sweetheart in front of the estate attorney and squeezed my shoulder and said, Your mother loved you so much. She would want us to stay close. What he actually wanted was to know whether she had told me anything. I gave him nothing. I smiled. I thanked people for coming. I accepted casseroles. I was the picture of a grieving, bewildered daughter. I'm a forensic accountant. I'm very good at looking bewildered. On a gray Thursday morning in early March, I walked into the Citizens Bank branch in downtown Providence, wearing my oldest coat, my hair in a ponytail, looking exactly like a tired woman running a routine errand. The box was in a private room that smelled like metal and cold air. Inside, I found 4 items. A passbook for a savings account in my name with a balance I had to read twice. Then a third time, pressing my finger beneath each digit to make sure I wasn't transposing numbers. A sealed letter addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. A USB drive. And a folded piece of paper with a single sentence written on it. He forged my signature. The notary was bribed. Box 114 has the proof. The account balance was $412,000. That was not the number that made my hands shake. What made my hands shake was what I found on the USB drive when I got back to my car and plugged it into my laptop. My mother had spent 10 years building a quiet, meticulous archive. Bank statements. Wire transfers. Forged signature comparisons she'd had done privately by a handwriting analyst. Shell company registrations in Delaware and Wyoming, all bearing Douglas's initials buried in the registered agent names. A notarized statement from a woman named Patricia Harmon, who had served as the bribed notary in 2016 and had apparently developed a conscience in 2021. My mother hadn't been passive. She had been strategic. She had known she was sick before she told anyone. and she had spent the final chapter of her life not in surrender, but in construction, building the case, piece by piece, document by document, and hiding it somewhere he would never think to look. In her daughter's name. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. The heat fogged the windows. I thought about the apartment in Providence, the library books, the cereal dinners. She always meant well, Douglas had said, raising his glass. No, I thought. She meant everything. Douglas called on a Sunday. He'd waited long enough that the call was meant to feel casual, unhurried. The call of a man with nothing to hide. Serena. I've been thinking. Your mother had a few small accounts here and there, you know how she was, squirreling things away. I want to make sure we handle the estate cleanly. If you come across any paperwork, any old account numbers, just forward them to my attorney and we'll consolidate everything properly. I let a beat of silence pass. Of course, I said. That makes sense. He exhaled slowly. Good girl. I knew you'd understand. You always were the practical one. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down every lie contained in that 2-minute conversation. He said small accounts. Plural. As if he already knew there was more than one. He said consolidate. Which means transfer. Which means disappear, he said my attorney. Not the estate attorney. His. He called me good girl. Which is what you say to someone you still believe you own. I called my colleague Marcus the next morning. Marcus is a former IRS special agent who now consults privately. He owes me a favor from a case in 2021 involving a Connecticut hedge fund and a truly spectacular paper trail. I told him what I had. He went quiet for a long moment. How complete is the documentation? He asked. Complete enough, I said. Define complete enough. Forged signatures with a notarized comparison report. Wire transfers to 4 shell companies over 11 years. A witness affidavit from the notary. Bank records showing the original asset values before and after transfer. Another silence. Serena, Marcus said. Do not contact him again without recording it. Douglas invited me to dinner at his house in Greenwich 3 weeks later. A Sunday roast, he said. Just family. His idea of just family included his attorney, a man named Gerald, whom he introduced as an old friend while Gerald's eyes catalogued me with a precision that was entirely professional. I brought wine. A nice bottle. I was warm. A little distracted. Slightly overwhelmed, I played the version of myself that Douglas had always preferred. The daughter who was smart enough to be useful but not smart enough to be dangerous. Over the lamb. Douglas steered the conversation to the estate. Gerald has been helping me organize things, he said, casual as weather. Your mother's assets, such as they were, are fairly straightforward. The house will need to go on the market, the upkeep alone is. What about the Whitmore fund? I asked. A flicker. So fast I would have missed it if I hadn't been watching for it. The fund is a separate instrument, Gerald said smoothly. It was established independently of the marital estate. Your mother's contributions were made under a signed power of attorney, I said. Which I'd love to review. Douglas smiled. Of course. Gerald can send those over. Thank you, I said. I'll have my attorney look at them. You have an attorney? Douglas asked. The warmth dropped 2 degrees. I'm a forensic accountant, Douglas. I have several. Gerald cleared his throat. The lamb sat uneaten. On the drive home, I checked the recording app on my phone. Clean. Complete. Douglas had confirmed the fund's existence, confirmed the power of attorney, and confirmed without quite realizing it that he expected me to accept whatever documents he produced without verification. I sent the file to Marcus that night. He's going to move assets, Marcus replied within the hour. Probably within 2 weeks. We need to be ready. We were ready. The Greenwich Philanthropic Society holds its annual gala every April, at the Delamar Hotel. It is the kind of event that exists to allow wealthy people to be publicly generous with a small fraction of the money they have spent the rest of the year protecting. Douglas was receiving the Civic Legacy Award. He had been nominated by 3 board members whose foundations had received donations from the Whitmore Fund donations my mother's money had technically funded. I was not invited. Douglas called 4 days before the event to extend a last-minute invitation. His tone was careful. Now the warmth had a metallic edge, like something trying too hard. It would mean a lot, he said. To have you there. For your mother. Translation. He wanted me visible and docile in public while the asset transfer he'd quietly initiated 3 days prior went uncontested. I wouldn't miss it, I said. I wore midnight blue. A structured column dress, simple and expensive, the kind of thing my mother would have worn before Douglas told her that drawing attention to herself was unbecoming. I did my own hair. I drove myself. I arrived during cocktail hour. I smiled at people I recognized and a few I didn't. I accepted a glass of sparkling water and made small talk about nothing. Douglas spotted me from across the room. His expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and recovery in under 2 seconds. He was good. I'll give him that. He crossed the room and gripped my elbow just above the joint, not hard enough to hurt, hard enough to steer. You look lovely, he said through his smile. Come. Sit at the family table. In a moment, I said. I wanted to say hello to Gerald first. The grip tightened slightly. Gerald isn't. He's by the bar, I said pleasantly. I can see him from here. I moved toward Gerald. Douglas followed. I introduced myself warmly, asked Gerald how he was enjoying the evening, made easy conversation about nothing until I watched Douglas visibly relax. Then I excused myself to use the restroom. In the hallway outside the ballroom, I pressed send on my phone. The filing had been prepared for 6 days. Marcus had coordinated with a contact at the Connecticut Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit. The complaint included the forged signature documentation, the wire transfer records, the notary affidavit, and the audio recording from the Sunday dinner in which Douglas had confirmed the fund's structure and his sole authority over its assets. The asset freeze was already in process. The documentation had been reviewed. They had been waiting for my confirmation that Douglas was present and not in transit. I walked back into the ballroom. I took my seat at the family table. Douglas was called to the stage at 8:45. He accepted the award graciously, spoke movingly about community and legacy and the importance of giving back what you've been given, and thanked the foundation that bore his mother's name. He was still holding the award when 2 men in dark suits entered through the side door of the ballroom and walked with quiet authority toward the stage. I watched his face in the moment he understood. It was not the face of a man who had been caught. It was the face of a man who had believed, until that precise second, that people like me simply did not do things like this to people like him. That was the miscalculation that cost him everything. Not the forged signatures. Not the shell companies. Not even the paper trail my mother had spent a decade assembling. It was the assumption that grief makes people weak. Douglas Voss, the lead agent said. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of trust assets. He looked at me across the room. I looked back. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The asset freeze held. Gerald was disbarred pending a separate investigation. The Whitmore Fund was placed under court receivership within 30 days, and a forensic audit confirmed what my mother's USB drive had documented. 11 years of systematic asset transfer, totaling just over $2.3 million redirected from marital assets my mother had brought into the marriage. The estate was reclassified. I am not going to pretend the legal process was fast or clean. It was neither. It took 8 months, 2 attorneys, 1 deposition, and more paperwork than I care to count. But it moved. The Providence apartment building, the original one, the one my mother had sold to fund Douglas's first venture, had long since changed hands twice. We couldn't recover it. But the court-ordered restitution, combined with my mother's savings account and a portion of the frozen assets, came to a figure that would have seemed impossible to the woman eating cereal dinners in that apartment 30 years ago. I used part of it to establish a scholarship in my mother's name at the school, where she taught before she quit, for first-generation students studying education. It was her idea. Actually, she'd written it in the letter in the safety deposit box. She'd thought of everything. I kept the rest. Saved it. Invested it carefully. And went back to work on Monday. I'm still a forensic accountant. I still find the money people swear doesn't exist. I'm better at it now. More patient. More precise. I understand something about hidden assets that no textbook quite captures. The people who hide them always believe the people they've stolen from are too grateful, too frightened, or too small to look closely. My mother looked closely for 11 years, and handed me the result in a bronze key on a plain ring. He's going to tell you there's nothing, she said. She was right. He did. She was also right about the other part. There was everything. I want to say something before you scroll away. This is not a story about revenge. I know it looks like one. I know the ballroom scene, and the handcuffs, and the award speech interrupted by a federal warrant have a certain satisfying shape to them. But what I think about, most mornings, is my mother in that hospital room, too sick to sit up, carefully explaining the location of a safety deposit box. What I think about is the 10 years she spent, quietly, methodically, building something she wasn't sure she'd live to see used. She didn't do it out of bitterness. She did it out of love, and out of a completely clear-eyed understanding that the person she loved me was going to need protection she could no longer provide in person. That's the lesson. If there is one. Not that you should scheme. Not that you should trust no one. But that the people who dismiss you, who call you small, who raise a glass to your irrelevance, who assume that your grief will make you manageable, they are almost always wrong about one thing. They think invisible means powerless. My mother was invisible in that house for 15 years. She saw everything. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've lived through something like this, I'd genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one.